Well, welcome to the platform launch event for the Global Building Data Initiative. My name is David Ruggiero, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussions. I'm a professor of structural design and engineering at EPFL in Switzerland, and I'm honored to also serve as the chairperson for the Joint Committee on the Globe Consensus. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today as we take this important step towards improving how we collect, share, and ultimately use data in the built environment. Quickly, before we dive into the discussions, I'll take a few moments to give some context on how the Global Building Data Initiative, or GBDI, came to be and why it matters. So it was born out of the work of GLOBE, which is the Global Consensus on Sustainability in the Built Environment. And the Joint Committee on GLOBE was established by 6 associations in the domain of construction and civil engineering, which are, in no particular order, RILEM, CIB, ECCS, FIB, YABC, and IASS. And GLOBE also maintains partnerships with Alcon, PAT, and Ibercon. So this gives a broad international base of expertise in this field through the membership of these associations. So at a GLOBE workshop on benchmarking of embodied carbon in buildings held in February of 2023, I believe, we identified one of the key challenges as the lack of standardized, accessible, and reliable data on whole life carbon, especially embodied carbon in buildings and structures, which is needed to support decision-making at all levels. So recognizing this challenge, GBDI was established under the GLOBE umbrella and has made great progress in its first year, as you'll see today. It's made links with other groups looking at carbon accounting and produced an open data format that drives the data platform that Martin will demonstrate. In today's event, we have an hour and a half, so we'll start with a keynote speech followed by a technical presentation from Martin Rook. Then there will be a panel discussion with a group of industry experts and the opportunity for you to ask your questions to the panel and the GBDI team. Just as a matter of housekeeping, we ask that you please keep your microphone muted and note that this event is being recorded. And for any questions, please use the Q&A tab, not the chat, so that we can keep them organized. With that, let's get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dima Khoury, who is the facilitator for the Buildings Breakthrough at Global ABC, the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is under the United Nations Environment Program. So Dima, I invite you to share your screen and hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, David. Just going to share my screen. So thanks so much for the invitation, and good morning and afternoon to you all. Thanks for inviting me to participate. And the Global ABC to participate in this milestone online event. My name is Dima Khoury, as David mentioned, and facilitating on the Buildings Breakthrough within the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. So the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, also known as Global ABC, is hosted by UNEP, was founded at COP21, and is a leading global platform for all building stakeholders committed to a common vision towards zero-emission, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. It currently holds 339 members, including 42 countries, and some of its flagships includes the Buildings GSR, Global Status Report, regional and country roadmaps. We also host the COP Building Pavilions. Last March, we hosted an inaugural Buildings and Climate Global Forum in Paris. And the Global ABC is comprised of the building sector community, of course, which is at its core and which as well forms hubs and action groups on various thematics. Our main work consists of being a global advocate and a catalyst to action. We focus on deep collaboration. We participate in high-level international events, of course, including COPs, and collaborate with UNFCCC mechanisms as well. We support countries in setting priorities and measures based on their situations. This is through building decarbonization roadmaps, for instance, the Buildings Breakthrough, or through our work on NDCs and NDC frontrunner criteria and tools. We're also a trusted platform to set targets and track progress. This is mainly done through the annual Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction that tracks the sector every year. So as mentioned, the Buildings GSR is a global reference and gives an annual snapshot of the progress of the buildings and construction sector globally towards achieving the Paris Agreement goals. In its 8th edition, it presented the drivers of CO2 emissions and energy demand globally, the status of policies, finance, and key actions that support a zero-emission and resilient building sector, and findings from the global building climate trackers as well. The numbers are known to everyone, so the graph here is not the most updated one, but today we are approximately at 34% CO2 energy-related emissions and 34% energy demand globally. The 2024 forthcoming Building GSR is scheduled to be launched in Q1 of this year, and I believe this is going to be launched next month, actually. The Building Climate Tracker, which is part of this Buildings Global Status Report, indicates that the buildings and the construction sector remains off track to achieve decarbonization by 2050. The gap between the current state and the desired decarbonization path is quite significant, amounting, as you can see, to a gap of 42 decarbonization points. This is due to a growing global emissions of the sector and, of course, slowing investments and policy efforts. All this highlight that we are not on track. So let's look where we want to go. Net zero buildings by 2050, of course. So to get there, we need to achieve progress on an annual basis. And you can see since 2021, progress has slightly improved, with the decarbonization index rising to 2.3 points in 2022 and 4.8 points in 2023. And it is currently resuming its upward trajectory, although we are still far off from reaching targets. If you are interested to have more details on the methodology that was used and more updates on the status of the buildings sector, I invite you to view the 8th edition of this Global Status Report that you can find on our website. This is all to highlight that buildings are responsible for a significant portion of global energy consumption and CO2 emissions, and they present an immense opportunity to drive transformative change through energy efficiency, mitigation measures, and policies. This includes, of course, the adoption and implementation of standards related to energy efficiency and mitigation. Also, we know that buildings offer a very cost-effective potential for achieving these targets among all industrial sectors. And if we don't act in the building sector, there's going to be major losses, with a big part being induced by climate change. And this is to occur if we don't act now. But this is not only about climate change, of course, this is also about people and well-being and contributing to SDG goals, spur low-carbon economic growth, create skilled employment opportunities, enhance energy security, reduce poverty, energy poverty, improve air quality, our environment, biodiversity, and people's well-being. So as I said, there's huge potentials for the sector to reduce emissions. And the will for that can be set by countries this year. So as we know, and as per the 4.9 article of the Paris Agreement, governments are expected to enhance their commitments every 5 years through the NDCs. And these should be aligned with the 1.5 degree limit. Most national determined contributions still lack today clear action and targets towards building energy efficiency and adaptation measures. So this is an opportunity to raise ambition levels in NDCs through actions in the buildings and construction sector. Today, we have 194 countries and the European Unions who have submitted NDCs. However, only 11 updated, expanded action on buildings related on buildings. For example, we have the UAE, who have targets of 56% reduction in buildings emission by 2030 through updated codes and renewable energy initiatives. But despite all these efforts, G20 nations lack extensive building coverage in their NDCs, and overall programs remain modest. Another important action is the building codes, building energy codes. And in 2023, so currently there is 90 countries that have mandatory codes, and only very few of them are aligned with the net zero one. In 2023, 83 countries have mandatory codes, with a further 7 that have mandatory codes only for some buildings. 14 countries and subnational jurisdictions have updated their codes since 2024, and very few countries have net zero carbon building codes. So this lack of progress is linked to the slow reduction of building energy intensity, the lack of building energy codes aligned to net zero emissions. And finally, this is also reflected in the lack of details on buildings and NDCs. Currently, we know that most efforts focus on operational efficiency. And while this is important, operational emissions and energy efficiency measures are a high priority. They must be combined with material efficiency strategies. With global floor area growth, construction materials are set to dominate resource consumption. Embodied carbon emissions still represent more than a quarter of the sector's emissions and are set to double. Building materials have a big impact potential on carbon emissions, and some estimates pointing to nearly half of such emissions originating from the material extraction, construction, maintenance, and disposal of materials. In the sector, we're currently facing a lock-in risk for a high carbon development path, unless the consideration of new norms of lower carbon and responsibly sourced materials, better design and construction practices, and energy efficiency becomes common practice. We need to decarbonize, for that matter, along the life cycle. So it's vital to design out waste and emissions from the start. The question to ask is whether anything new is needed to be built in the first place. Alternatives to new construction should be also explored. For existing buildings, which is the case for most of the mature economies, where a majority of the building stock already exists, increasing the use of existing assets and promoting renovation and adaptive reuse is key. In contrast, in emerging economies such as the building stock is yet to be built. In this case, where new construction is a necessity, designs should aim to maximize building lifespans through modular construction, incorporating design for disassembly, construction practices, and promoting resource and material efficiency. So there's an opportunity to reduce carbon in each stage of the project development, but most potential to avoid embodied carbon really lies during the planning and design stages. One of the frameworks is the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework, and it suggests an increase in recycled materials and bio-based materials, and a decrease in non-renewable materials. This could be done by avoiding waste, building less, and a life cycle analysis can guide in design decisions. having resource efficient design, support local value chains to lower transport emissions, apply circularity with recyclability, reuse, and durability approaches. Second, to shift to bio-based materials. This would require developing supply chains for locally available materials, standardizing and certifying these materials, and making them mainstream. And third, improve conventional building materials and processes with process innovation to reduce CO2, substituting with secondary or waste material, energy efficiency of production, and decarbonizing the energy supply. All this as well relates to sufficiency measures. We know that 50% of buildings that will exist in 2050, have yet to be built. So this is a big challenge that we are facing in the sector. And the global floor area expansion will outpace emissions reductions unless policy interventions integrate all these measures, including low carbon materials, whole building performance approaches, passive design strategies, building renovation and reuse, circular economy, and sufficiency measures, including the avoid, shift, and improve framework. So sufficiency specifically is a set of measures that include rethinking and assessing needs. And in buildings, it focuses on reducing overall resource consumption by aligning building designs, operation, and occupant behavior with sustainable living practices. So this could be at a macro level. So for instance, use of brownfield versus greenfield, to a more micro level. So first reassessing needs, of course, of new build, renovating before building, and assessing the use of material, even thinking of the height of a beam, for instance, to have it technically well designed and have proper design to avoid waste. So a question is, how can we translate sufficiency into policy and standards and bring such measures at the forefront of discussion? At the Global ABC, and with the Global ABC community, we're working to raise attention to all of this and bring change in the sector. In the last year, we have created a strong community that is paving the way for radical collaboration. And with all the members involved, we succeeded in bringing more attention to buildings in the climate discussions. A bit over a year ago now, we saw the launch of the Buildings Breakthrough and have organized last March as well a Stimulating Buildings and Climate Global Forum, leading to the first declaration for international action and collaboration to accelerate the decarbonization and resilience of buildings. This declaration was adopted by over 60 countries and aligns with the Global ABC roadmaps and actions. So these two major achievements gave an additional mandate and responsibility to the Global ABC, which makes us facilitate the Buildings Breakthrough and take on the Déclaration de Chaillot and its implementing arm, the Intergovernmental Council for Buildings and Construction. There is more information on these as well on the website if you are interested. For the Buildings Breakthrough, what are we doing within the Buildings Breakthrough? We are working on priority actions that come in response to recommendations that were set in the Breakthrough Agenda report by independent experts. So these priority actions have been developed with the Buildings Breakthrough members. These include the countries and leading organizations. And we are working on 5 priority areas or enabling conditions to move the sector. In B1, for instance, standard and certification. This area is facilitated by the World Green Building Council, and it aims to develop a qualitative definition for near zero emission and resilient buildings, and establish building level principles and reference existing measurement frameworks to guide implementation across different regional contexts. In B2, on demand creation, this is facilitated by the One Planet Network. We're working on a global framework for action for member states and relevant stakeholders to advance sustainable and circular public procurement with the aim to offer technical support to governments to implement this framework. On finance and investment, this is facilitated by the IFC and the Program for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. We have done a broad consultation to identify targeted activities to support expanding international financial and technical assistance program for the sector. This includes a mapping exercise of existing tools and processes aimed at mobilizing investment, as well as developing country-specific financial roadmaps. In B4 deployment, this is led by the Solar Impulse Foundation. We have developed a blueprint for solution deployment, which will evolve in catalog for solutions and will be launched at COP. In B5, we're working on capacity and skills, mostly focused on building codes, and we have launched an interim report on institutional and personal capacity to deliver near zero emission and resilient buildings. The next step would be to develop an online portal featuring priority resources. As I said, with a strong emphasis on building codes and establishment and compliance. So the work of the open building data platform will be, I think, important for the buildings breakthrough. It's at the foundation of all progress, I think, in all of these areas of the buildings breakthrough. And yeah, we look forward to learning more about it. And see how we can incorporate it in our work in the buildings breakthrough, and because it's also at the core of progress, of course, of each of these enabling conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dima, for that really interesting and frankly sobering presentation, which clearly shows the urgency. If there are any questions for Dima, I encourage you to write them in the Q&A, and we'll address them during the panel discussion in about half an hour. So now, to take this in an optimistic direction, I'm happy to introduce Martin Ruck, who's the Executive Director of GBDI and founder of the RISE Institute for Regenerative Spatial Systems. He'll talk for about 20 minutes to explain more about GBDI and present the data format and platform. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and also thank you very much, Dima, for setting the scene with this great overview of the work at the UN level and the GABC. With GBDI, we are also very happy and proud to support the Buildings Breakthrough and the efforts that you've been talking about. And it's our pleasure to also be able to offer and share our bit of what we've been up to at the Global Building Data Initiative. And today, to celebrate with you the launch of the Open Building Data Platform. So let's get into it. First, let me also emphasize briefly the context. We're talking here about whole life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So we acknowledge the importance of energy use during the building life cycle, but we also know that material-related emissions are really important. You heard the numbers. Overall, around 40% of the global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are related to building construction and operation. And we know that for new buildings, embodied emissions can make up 50 or even up to 90% of life cycle related emissions, because buildings are really energy efficient and because materials are the remaining share of emissions. Out of those embodied emissions, we know that more than half, even 2/3, can be in the building structure, in the structural elements and the structural materials of buildings. So for us, it's really important to combine these perspectives of operational carbon emissions, as we said, from the building operation, with the embodied carbon emissions from material production and processing, as well as transport throughout the life cycle. And that's really also the focus of the Global Building Data Initiative, to combine these two and really have a life cycle perspective. Because we know, again, especially for new buildings, when we look at the emissions occurring across the building life cycle, we see that not just is the share of embodied carbon emissions increasing because buildings are ever more energy efficient, but we also see that there is an absolute increase in embodied carbon emissions, partly due to the increased complexity of modern buildings, but also due to inefficiencies or over-design of building structures, for example. And it's really significant and important to address embodied emissions that are occurring upfront. You can see here in this schematic billing life cycle and the emissions that are occurring, there is this upfront embodied carbon spike for the initial construction material production that really dominates the emissions over several decades. And actually, in view of climate change, it's really important to reduce those now. And for reducing those, it's important to understand where we are at the moment to get a sense and really a quantitative assessment of the embodied carbon baseline today. So to benchmark the current baseline, and different efforts have been working on this over the past few years. For example, in the European context, where we could benchmark the embodied carbon emissions for different types of buildings across Europe, and do it both per square meter to look at the kilograms of CO2 per square meter for different types of buildings, as well as per capita to draw in this sufficiency perspective that Dima already mentioned in her keynote, to also understand what does it mean, how many emissions do we have per person based on different types of buildings, different building typologies, different layouts also. And we could show that there are quite some differences between different building typologies. So overall, we see that there is really a movement towards assessing and benchmarking embodied and whole life carbon emissions globally. And as I said here on the left, you can see for different building use types in the European context, the benchmarks of kilogram per square meter. But we're also working, and also others are working on a global assessment of this data to really close the white spaces that we still have on the map. There is still a large lack of that data. But it's improving. And that is important because we know that already today we would have really high potential to reduce embodied emissions. Studies have shown that there is a potential of reducing 50 up to 75% of embodied emissions from material production and material use today through different measures. Some of them are avoid, shift, and improve measures, as Dima already said. But for really realizing this potential, we need better building data. And the problem today is data is still inconsistent, it's fragmented across tools, and overall it's still scarce. But that is really a situation that is changing with different countries mandating for whole life carbon assessments to become legal requirements for new building construction. Certainly that is the case in Europe, but also in other world regions, we really see progress on this end. And now that directly links to the GBDI mission and goals, where at GBDI we've set out to leverage open building data to inform industry and policy action for reducing resource use, so the embodied as well as the whole life carbon emissions of buildings. And we do that through three main aspects. One is the development of a coordinated, scalable open data protocol to facilitate the global exchange of whole life carbon information on buildings. The second one that we are showing you also today is the open source platform for data management and analytics. And the third one, which many of you have been involved throughout the last 1 and 2 years, is to build a global network and really build capacity with a focus on developing also partnerships with Global South actors. So for us, this is now a milestone for GBDI, where we close on our first phase one, where we set out to do these three things. And I'm happy to run you through it. Because today we can present the open billing data format, the openBDF, which as planned is an open billing data protocol. It has strong interoperability through the open interfaces that we integrated. It's free and easy to use with your tools. It's intended to be a common global language for data exchange on resource and energy use and whole life carbon emissions of buildings. And it's aligned with leading initiatives, and it's very flexible in the level of complexity that you can apply it for. It's also documented. There is clear technical documentation. There are scalable schemas with attributes and options that we already published here and that can be also advanced in the future. And it's built on a versatile code base using Python and JSON. So this is really something that, as David has already said, came out of the work of a Globe task force, but it's really aligned with development of other actors. For example, the ECO Group in North America, who's been working on a similar effort. And the way that we manage this lifecycle related material and energy information is through a modular data structure, where we have different levels of information. We store metadata at the project level, so that's kind of the building level. but we also have the level of assemblies, for example, external walls or structural columns, which can all have their own properties and are then composed of different construction products. So that allows us to, for example, describe the concrete quantity and also concrete specifications used in columns, in floors, that then make up the project. And linked to the project data, we also have impact data that can be EPD data sets or also generic background LCA data that can be used here. And all of this adopts the LCAX open source model, which we incorporated for the openBDF. And this is really available today. As I said, there is guidance on the protocol. The schema is available for you to review and also comment on, and certainly to implement in your work. And we have different integrations, different technical integrations already available today. There's a set of converters, so-called parsers, already available now, and I invite you to have a look and take them up in your own work. And now the most exciting part, because the open building data format for us is really the backbone, the data structure that we use internally and in the background to drive the open building data platform. And the open building data platform is really what brings it all to life. It's not just a data format, lines of code and data points, but it's a platform that you can actually have a look at, that you can use to manage the data, to interact with it, to visualize the data points. The open building data platform is developed to be a decentralized platform with a federated information architecture. That means that it can be deployed in many different places, where users or organizations can also retain their data ownership and control over their data and really use a common infrastructure for data management and analytics. The connection and communication between these different decentralized instances is then happening through open application interfaces. We have those open APIs integrated already today. They can be used to communicate between different platforms. They can also be used to integrate with existing tools, with existing workflows, and overall really support the exchange and also the benchmarking. Last but not least, an important feature for us is that all of this is open source development. So you can not just join the development and have a joint development of core functions, but you can actually use that code to customize it, to apply it in your own organization and tweak it as you need. So the idea here, to give you a picture, is really that in different world regions, in different organizations, we can have different databases where organizations manage their data, keep track of their own data, manage also the security and access, but then use a common data format, the open building data format, to exchange between them to allow interoperability. The way that it works is that you have your data in your own format, and you can use a parser to convert it into the open building data format. Now here you have a choice of anonymizing data, of aggregating data to really suit your needs. And you can then start comparing your openBDF data with the openBDF datasets of other people, of other organizations. And together, this pool of datasets can then be managed through the backend, where we provide data management and also management of users and organizations, and then eventually also visualized through the application to visualize, compare, or also use that data to improve designs. And this application, that I will also show you in a second, can be deployed in different ways. It can be run locally, it can be run on the web. You can have your own instance, or you can use the GBDI hub that I'm showing you now. But it's really important for me to emphasize that this is just one example of how this can be deployed. The code is there, the code is open source, and you could also deploy it on your end. Currently, we already have converters for key data formats, including the Echo data format, the Structural Panda database, the BECD database, the Slice data modeling. And there is really an opportunity to expand it, to develop more and more open source converters. Currently, we have more than 1,000 sample cases already in the platform. They are mostly from policy research in the European context, as well as from global meta-analysis. And our goal is to expand that together with you to have 10,000 cases or more by 2026. And we're really happy that there are a number of ongoing partnerships already happening today, and several new partnerships are currently being developed. Now, again, let me emphasize, this is ready now. You can find not just the application online, but you can also really find the source code for the converters, for the web app, on GitHub already now. You can see the handle here. It's Global Building Data Initiative. There are these two main repositories that might be of interest for you. Please check it out. Let us know what you think and also how this is useful to you. Now let's move to the platform, the main reason why we're here today. Before jumping into the demo, I want to give you just a quick overview of where we are at the moment. There are still several features that we already have planned. There are some features that are already ready and some features that are in progress. I will show you the user management, the dashboard view, benchmarking, and portfolio overview today. We're currently working also on features to assess the hotspots across the lifecycle and the hotspots of different building elements, for example. In those buildings, we have plans to work on a calculation engine and also to incorporate and be able to test different reduction strategies on the data that is being uploaded. So without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. And for that, I believe I quickly need to change how I share screen. So you should see my instance of the platform now.
We do,
That's
yes.
correct. Yes, perfect. Yes, great. So let me quickly run you through the platform. So this is what you get once you signed up to the platform, once you created your user profile and also organization. We already got the feedback. Some people are confused. You actually have to have an organization to use this platform. So unless someone else of your organization already signed up and created an organization that you can join, you actually have to create a new organization. I'm not going through that now, but that's the process. If you sign up, you're requested to either join or create an organization. If someone already created an organization, they can invite you. This is all actually very intuitive. So let's rather look into the data aspects. What you get here on this first page is the dashboard view. It gives you a general overview of the public sample. So in this case, if you have not yet uploaded data yourself, you will see the public sample that we have. And you can see there are a number of cases with a focus on Europe, but also from other world regions. And this is certainly also a growing set of data sets where we will incorporate in the future also other data that we can derive from meta-analysis from the scientific literature. And we plan to upload this here. And now for the current sample, you see that this is the overview of the greenhouse gas emissions, the GWP intensity, kilogram per square meter. The current scope is just the production emissions, A1 to A3. And you can see it has a number of different sources. That also explains why there is such a variety in the emission intensities, also because there are a number of billing typologies currently viewed and also from different countries. So what we can do, for example, is to limit this, to narrow it down, to just look at the residential building typologies and also narrow it down. Oh, that's unintended. Overall, the performance of the platform will depend on your setup, also on your connection to the server. Currently, this is hosted on the web. If you have a local instance, for example, this will be even faster. And usually it is faster than what we are experiencing now. Let's give it some more seconds. Otherwise, I also have a recording as a backup. Okay. I suggest that I'm very sorry that it doesn't work, and it's really not nice, but I will have to share with you a recording. And what you see here is what I recorded yesterday evening as a backup in case what just happened happens. You can see here the platform. You can see the map, different data sets from different countries. I'm also here clicking to provide an overview of the different countries. You can see the count of cases per country. And you can also get a first sense based on the size of the dot of how many cases we have from each country currently in the public sample. If you upload more data from your own organization, you will also see that on the map. And that will then be visible here. Now here we filter down to just the residential buildings, for example, to narrow down the sample, because that's important to keep in mind. If you want to have a robust benchmarking, you need to make sure that what you compare against is actually consistent or as close as possible to your own use case at this point. And I hear someone talking. Could you please mute your mic? Thank you. So then what you can also change, and what I did here, is to filter it for just one country to make it even more consistent and reduce the variability. And I also shifted from the emissions of the production stage, A1 to A3, so the embodied emissions of production, I shifted to B6. So B6 in this case now was the operational emissions. So depending on the data that is available in the underlying case studies or project data sets, you will be able to explore and also benchmark different values. Now we've moved from the dashboard overview to the portfolio analysis view, where here you can see the attributes overview. This is really just to give you an overview of different attributes. You can select them from this top bar to view up to 9 attributes at the same time to just get an overview of the distribution. These are so-called histograms, so they will show you the occurrence of a certain value in the overall database. So this is just to get a sense of what is the distribution of gross flow area or the floors above ground. So what's the composition really of the data sample? Also, which different types of structural frame do we have included here, and so on. And then below these histograms, you see this data table, which you can actually expand by clicking on the Hide or Show Columns tab. Here you can activate additional columns. You see there is a number of them. I'm just activating the frame type, for example, then to also filter by frame type. So if you click those few dots, you can actually filter. What I'm doing here is just entering concrete to filter by concrete. And that narrows down the list in the data table, but it also changes the histograms now to the sample, considering the current filter settings. And now for each of those cases, we can also explore the GWP, so the greenhouse gas emissions by life cycle stage, where this visualization, this bar on the right, gives us a first illustration of the emissions from the different life cycle stages, as well as in the column just left to it, the overall GWP intensity for all life cycle stages. Now, as a second use case, I have reset the filtering by frame type and are just looking up one particular country. So here I'm now only looking at all the cases from Germany. Be mindful, in the current beta version, you have to use the 3-letter country code to filter for countries. It can be a bit confusing, and we will fix it in future iterations. And then I'm filtering the building type to only show retrofits. So this works for both new buildings as well as retrofits, and then the visualization updates accordingly. As a next page that we show here is the carbon intensity page, where you can again select one attribute in this case, which is used to arrange the visualizations. Here we show the building typology and the results for the different building typologies in the dataset. And you can see so-called box plots that give a visualization of the distribution for different life cycle stages. So you can see there was the production stage, construction stage, and so on, and the distribution of values for different building typologies. And here again, if we scroll down, we get this data table. We can add different columns, for example, also the ID, which is kind of our internal unique identifier for each case study, which you can also take and copy paste it to identify a particular case definitely later on. And what I'm doing here, I again added the source as a filter and are just looking up now for all the cases that we have from the structural panda dataset, which is a dataset that is exclusively from the UK, and it's all for structural systems. So this is not whole buildings, but that's just structures. But it's very helpful because it is very consistent in terms of scope. So what I'm doing here now is to filter the structural panda dataset and only look at all the cases where buildings have 10 floors above ground or more. And you can see this automatically filters it down to a subset of cases that I can investigate further. One way to investigate that further is to look at individual projects through the benchmarking step. And here I think the video skipped a bit, but you select basically one of the projects based on its ID and project name. And then you get the view of a picture of the project. So what currently says Global Building Data Initiative can actually also be a picture of that particular project. It's just a placeholder that we put GBDI. And then you get an overview of the project. And here I will just jump back a bit. Let's try to, because here you can get an overview now in the spider chart, how the individual project compares with the overall reference, so the reference sample. And also on the right, you again have bar charts and box plots that give you an idea of the distribution. Also here in this order chart, you see how that particular project compares against all the others in the current sample. You get a sense of the lifecycle scope, so in terms of the lifecycle stages that are included in that particular case. And you get a list of all the metadata that is included for that particular project. And here you can see there are multiple pages of metadata. You can also see that there are multiple NA values. That means there is no data provided on that particular attribute, but it gives you a sense of all the information that can be included for different projects. And it really depends also on how the data is provided for uploading and then processing on that database. So that's a quick run through of the Global Building Data Platform. And next time I will do it live. Some of you have already seen live demos in the past, but yes, sorry that it didn't work this time. So, and I think that's that from me at this point.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, that was a great summary of what GBDI is and how people can get involved. And yeah, unfortunately, the demo ghosts are a real thing, but I can confirm, having used the platform, that has worked great for me. Very responsive and really solid visualization. So I can't wait to see it populated with more data. Now we move on to the final part of this event, which is a panel discussion. We'll welcome 7 more panelists, experts in the field of sustainable development from policy, industry, professional research angles. And I'll briefly introduce our panelists. So we'll start in no particular order with Will Arnold, who is the head of climate action at the Institution of Structural Engineers, IStructE. Hi, Will. We have Vanderlei John, who's professor of building materials at Building Materials Department of Construction Engineering at USP, Universidade de São Paulo, and an initiating member of GLOBE and advisor of GBDI. Hello, Vanderlei. We have Dietram Opelt, managing director of HEAT, working on the Asia low carbon buildings transition. Next, Nigel Tonks, who is Sustainable Development Director for Europe. Omid Saberi, Global Lead Green and Resilient Buildings at IFC, the International Finance Corporation. Anil Sawhney, the Head of Sustainability at RICS, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. And last but not least, Karen Scrivener, the Head of the Laboratory of Construction Materials at EPFL, Project Director of the LC3 project, initiating member of GLOBE, and the Chief Advisor of GBDI. So thank you all for joining in today, in addition to Dima and Martin, who will ask to remain on here. And I think we can highlight you so that you should be visible to all of our participants. Nigel. So maybe I'll begin with a general question to our panelists, and then as we go, we'll take some questions from the Q&A also. First of all, what do you say are the main challenges today in advancing sustainable practices in the built environment, and what role does open and high quality data play? I'll open this up to the floor, but maybe Dima, since you gave our keynote, you can elaborate on this first.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Martin, for this presentation, and congrats for the launch of this platform. So as mentioned during the presentation, all efforts that are currently taking place in the sector are being outpaced by exponential growth of global floor area. So I'd say we need a more holistic and comprehensive view on things and actions wherever we can. We know what needs to be done and we have the tools. We need to act on implementation. And there are many areas where this can happen. So policies and regulatory frameworks need to be more holistic, incorporating a whole life cycle approach, so operational and embodied, and creating locally adapted benchmarks aligned with overall targets. Also, conventional materials have a high carbon footprint, with cement and steel being at the forefront or at the top of the list. Some efforts are underway, like the cement and steel breakthrough, are making progress in these areas. But alternatives should also be encouraged, bio or geo-based materials and recycled contexts. These are currently not readily available and have a high cost. We can take circular economy into account and modular principles to allow disassembly or material reuse and more efficient waste management. Currently, there's a high level of material disposal instead of recycling and repurposing. It will be also important to look at a whole building approach, having a good envelope, prioritizing passive design before complementing with high energy efficiency equipment and appliances. All of this can require a higher upfront investment, and despite long-term cost benefits, and currently options or access to green finance mechanisms for low carbon projects remain limited. So data plays an important role here. Currently, there are gaps and a lack of transparency in high quality data on emissions, materials, and performance. And data can allow, of course, more consistency in the methodologies for assessing whole life carbon or LCA, and support in comparing and benchmarking performance across projects, both at local and national levels.
Thank you, Dima. And perhaps if we could ask Nigel from the industry aspect, how do you contribute to the data that is available both publicly and within your company, within Arup, because I know you do a lot of benchmarking yourselves. And how do you think that this can contribute to sustainable practices globally?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Martin. I think high quality data plays a really huge role for us, particularly accurate, granular, and comparable data can really empower the industry. Buildings take 2, 3, 4, 5 more years to develop, and as Dima has absolutely rightly said, that the biggest impact we can have is at the early planning phase for building. So the scrutiny and the smart decisions need to be made really early on in projects, and having this data available will really empower the supply chain to make decisions, particularly around low-hanging fruit, and look for good practice and best practice. Regional level policymakers need relevant evidence. They need this evidence to be able to have the confidence to set benchmarks to limit whole life carbon emissions for construction. So that's the level playing field that we all desperately need, and policymakers need that evidence. Industry is dominated by small, medium enterprise businesses, so providing them free access to this wealth of information is a massive enabler to the whole of industry. Collecting this data will the transparency, I think, will improve competitiveness in the market as firms try harder to demonstrate the value that they can bring to development to make the smart reductions. I mean, it really needs consistency, and we'll come back to that. But I think the last big point that I would make, certainly in the international aspect, some economies are really advanced now at requiring whole life carbon submissions for planning, but many regions are not. So being able to put this data out there enables all regions to get involved in the conversation and start to understand, even if it's secondary data that's not directly linked to their market, it really enable those conversations around the world to get to grips with reducing whole life carbon emissions.
But the transparency of it is definitely key, I think. Thank you, Nigel. And maybe we'll go to Anil from the professional. RICS is a professional body. From your side, how do you incorporate big data of this nature into the work you do there?
Thank you, David. I think I'll start perhaps with a positive note. Excellent work happening globally, and this is a clear example of Martin, David, and your team doing great work, which would have a global impact. I think if you sort of look at the challenges we face, I really like, first of all, the title of the workshop today on whole life cycle climate action. So if you look at that aspect, as you know, RICS is a global professional body with about 145,000 members globally. We run an annual sustainability survey, about 4,000 to 5,000 responses are received. One of the key highlights from that survey, which we put in our sustainability report annually, is that about 15% of respondents currently measure embodied carbon. Now, that's a pretty low number, meaning they measure and use that calculation for making decisions about their buildings, about their assets, about their projects. So it clearly shows that there is much more that needs to be done. So if you peel the onion a little bit further, you will see the challenges we ask for why the current state. Obviously, the first issue that pops up is a standardized methodology for measuring whole life carbon or GHG emissions, as Martin was saying earlier. So I think working as a global initiative to creating high-level principles that will standardize how measurements are done is probably very crucial. The second thing is really about how we standardize reporting to make sure comparison can be done. I'm sure many of you have heard economists call the construction sector a comparison-resistant sector. So they feel that we don't want to compare. Probably history goes back to cost comparisons in our sector, where many a times we don't want to freely share cost information about our projects and assets. I think you can easily extrapolate that to carbon as well. So really this effort that is ongoing helps address that issue. So it's very clear, especially if we don't make carbon transparent, its measurement and reporting transparent, it's very difficult to show how we are making progress on our decarbonization journey. So GBDI helps in bringing transparency through not only data standards, through those APIs, and converters, but also populating that information, that assessment data, product data, and entity data into a global database. So for mature economies, as Nigel was mentioning, contributing more and more data helps improve practice. And for regions, areas where there is still more work needs to be done, it provides that light to see the decarbonization pathway forward as they begin their journey. So I think this is all positive, excellent work being done. So as a global professional body, we want to focus on standardizing how we measure, standardizing how we report, data standards on how climate data can not only be exchanged, but also reported. So all those things align with the work GBDI is doing.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Anna. And you mentioned there about developing countries and different regional, uh, different regional cases, and maybe that leads into another question for everyone, but also maybe targeted at Dietram. I mean, in what way is data from the global uh, crucial on a global scale? How can having better data from the global south help the rest of the world?
Yeah, David, happy to pick up on that. Yeah, so we are engaged in a project from the International Climate Initiative sponsored by the German government. And this is targeting embodied carbon in 5 countries, including India, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And so probably those countries are where most of the embodied carbon is going to happen in the future. In buildings. And I think as one of the facts or the challenges is like when we talk about NDCs in these countries and buildings, you will find very little about embodied carbon, which is, like what we heard is 40% and growing in the percentage share in relevance over time. So in the NDC, so far only energy efficiency is addressed because it's a black spot what the embodied carbon basically entails. There's no information in nearly all of the countries on the impact of embodied carbon and what it means. And then, so the embodied carbon is basically shown up in the NDCs, if at all, in the industry sector, and the linkage between buildings and industry is also not made, but it's very important to introduce this kind of initiatives, and also congratulations from my side to the launch of the platform, to have more insights in the data, and to highlight what is, and to create demand from the building sector for low carbon materials. I mean, cement and steel is making, at least for large buildings, the big chunk of the embodied carbon. And like, if we make that transparent, what is carbon impact, I think that can create this demand for alternative materials, but also low carbon steel and cement, which is, I think, is absolutely crucial. And so I would say it's important. And the situation is, so in our project, we're establishing also tools which we make available to the governments and also online for assessing the carbon. And we will take sample of initially 300 buildings across the countries, and then benchmark the embodied carbon and the operational carbon. And then I then get data on what is the impact. And then we would like to use that data and the benchmarks to have standards which can be matched with the bill of quantities of the buildings which are available, and then be used for green public procurement benchmarking and standards, but also taxonomies for financing. So that is, but the data is key, and I think this is great to have these linkages and the exchange, so we can use data globally to inform the countries, but also like interregionally. It's a very starting point, so we have to start from the scratch. But over time, I think that needs to build, and that's absolutely essential.
Thank you. Yeah, Dietram, thanks. And you mentioned the NDCs, and nationally determined contributions, and Dima mentioned it as well. And I found it notable that we are all having this discussion about embodied carbon, and yet it seems like the word is not quite getting out there yet. So pose the question maybe to Will, because you're quite active in this. How do you think we can best make stakeholders understand the impact of embodied carbon?
Thanks, David. I mean, I'd probably start by saying that this goes far beyond embodied carbon, right? What we're actually talking about is use of construction materials, and the embodied carbon impacts the metric that we're measuring and talking about today. But of course, half the world's material extraction is construction material, and a third of the world's waste is construction material. So really what we're talking about is those metrics as well. And when we talk about things like GBDI to better understand how much stuff we're using, that's with a view to using less and controlling those broader impacts on pollution, impacts on habitat destruction, and impacts on waste, as well as just direct impacts into the climate. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind. Firstly, in terms of how, like, to try and answer your question a bit more directly, how do we engage more people on this topic? I think we're seeing more and more sort of clients and developers and funders becoming aware of all of this. It's just not happening maybe quite at the pace we need. We've got to remember that, I mean, this is included within things like NDCs, right? Because it's just counted under industrial emissions for a country. It's just that nobody is yet saying, well, hang on, that part of this country's emissions are due to the concrete that ends up in buildings or the bricks that end up in buildings. So I think that the point into this is about raising awareness of the pieces of those emissions that we are, we're talking about in some ways already, but we're not directly linking them to our use of design and construction of buildings and of infrastructure that joins them together. I think as soon as people get that, because it's a fairly simple thing to understand, you then start getting the right questions asked from clients. And this is why we're seeing this sort of uptake of this topic across the built environments around the world, albeit too slowly. I think that I also say that things like GBDI help with this because, of course, when engineers are working to try and understand what good looks like, and designers are trying to work to understand what good looks like, they can't do that if they don't have access to reams of previous projects. And for a large international firm that already tracks thousands of projects a year, that's fairly easy to do because you're tracking your own projects and you know that a hospital should be deliverable for a certain amount of carbon per square meter or a certain amount of carbon per bed or per people. But if you're in a small firm, and as Nigel said, most of our industry is small firms, you probably just don't have access to those numbers. And so I think what's most crucial with this data actually is about just helping give that gut feel to designers and builders, particularly from the smaller parts of industry around the world, to help them understand what that benchmark is that they're meant to be aiming for in the first place, not just in terms of carbon, but in terms of material quantities and material use as well.
Which is one of the things I meant to say as well, that the GBDI is tracking full. The file format is very flexible for that. Great. So one question I think probably for Omid, who I haven't picked on yet. So we talk about the change that needs to happen, but what kind of financial incentives can accelerate the adoption of a data-driven approach to whole life carbon reduction?
Thank you, David. And first of all, I also echo what Anil said to congratulate the team that delivered this program. And with Karen and Martin, we have been discussing this initiative for probably over 2 years now, and I'm very happy to see that it's coming to the life. So that's really good. In terms of the work that we have been doing in IFC, we are part of the World Bank and support private sector development around the world. And the work that we have doing from the financing point of view, I think I would like to put them in few categories of the elements that can support this transition. I would like to start with, when there is data transparency, then there can be easily more innovation happening. And, we were hearing from Will that and Nigel how having the access to data can create new work streams. One of the things that we have seen within IFC is that we are seeing now companies innovating new ways of producing steel or cement with much lower carbon emissions. And that has created the investment opportunities that starts in developed countries, but then it extends to developing countries. For example, we worked with Boston Metals that they are creating a new zero carbon steel, and now they are planning to extend it to Latin America and to Africa. And that's really good example of how this data transparency then can have a ripple effect in the industry. The other thing is around transition finance. We have been supporting transition finance of supply chain towards zero carbon, and transparency on embodied carbon can then have a ripple effect on what can we do with our supply chain. And that's really not an easy nut to crack, because when you look at the supply chain, you are dealing with so many players in the building industry, and each of them would have complex conditions. And what we have done in trade finance, for example, is that we provide lower interest rate financing for the suppliers that they come with a lower carbon emissions. And that really starts, even number one, measuring it, number two, having a plan to reduce it, and number three, implement reduction plan. And those elements, we have seen enormous results coming out of those type of financing solutions. The other one that I want to briefly mention is blended finance, with the donor community wanting to impact the supply chain. Blended finance means that we can blend the donor funds with lower interest rates to encourage the players to take action. We discussed about the policies, but policy on disclosure is important. How can we encourage policy on disclosures in emerging markets mainly? Obviously, Europe has been ahead of the game. And lastly, I want to talk about taxonomies, supporting, while we talk here within this community, we probably all understand what we are talking about. But when you go to the for example, to the financial sector or government or other institutions, understanding these concepts is not easy. We have to make it easy to understand rather than complex scientific language, so that others can come in and contribute. The more, and this platform is quite, what I like about the platform is that we can easily see and compare the performance between the countries or between the solutions or between the buildings. And that really starts to make it easier for other institutions to come and play a role here. Back to you, David. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks, Omid. So it's great to hear that there are some levers that you think we have for affecting this change. Since we are reaching sort of the end of our time, I will take some questions from the chat here relating to the GBDI platform itself, and I'll open it also to Karen and Vanderlei, and Martin, who have been involved with this development. Maybe a tricky question. There's one that asks, what protocols are in place to identify the trustworthiness and provenance of the data provided? So how are we ensuring that the data that's going into the public repository is trustworthy?
Yes, I guess that's one for me. So that's a really important point, and it's a great question, obviously, that we get often, and also that we've been thinking about ourselves. At this point, it's really a challenge to get a hold on data overall. I mean, as I said, this data is still very scarce and it's fairly inconsistent. So at the moment, what we do is there is data that we actually have control over because we've been involved in the modeling, or we actually know who modeled it, and then we can check with them to really understand the scope and make sure that it's properly documented. Also, when it goes up on the platform, that's the one case. But the current sample is composed to a large degree also through meta-analysis of the scientific literature, where we are really also just dependent on the level of detail that whole life carbon results are being reported in the literature. And that is really varying across publications and across cases. And it's also actually a background also that led to my own interest in developing something like GBDI and consistent and common data formats for the documentation of building LCA and whole life carbon of buildings, because we lack standards. And now with this development, we actually bring forward also very specific data protocols and data formats that can be used and that provide the detailed attributes that should be filled and should be provided as you conduct an assessment. So to answer the question, currently we don't have these mechanisms in place just because we have to make it work with the data that is out there, and that data is inconsistent. So the way at the moment is to really filter down to a sample that is relevant for a given comparison. But we hope that in the future, through alignment on methodologies, we heard Anil speak on it, we also heard others speak on it, through aligned methodologies and also a growing sample of data, we will be able to incorporate also tests to check the completeness and also to check the plausibility of the data that is being submitted. And that's really something that we're looking into also in the next step of development.
And Anil, you want to say something?
I just want to say, I mean, with this foundation, the platform GBDI that Martin, Karen, and the team have built, you can take it to the next level and maybe use AI tools to help improve or search for inconsistencies or issues with the data quality. So I think once we have laid a strong foundation, there are other technologies that can help.
Once you talk about getting 10,000 or 100,000 examples, and we're definitely into big data territory. Nigel?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say it is absolutely a big task for industry everywhere to get on top of accurate and comparable data and methodology. But, just speaking from experience, within Arup, we have buildings in over 100 different countries and jurisdictions, and it is an enormous challenge, even within a single organization, to have the conversations to say, well, for us to be able to compare across our different design teams to make sure that we're giving consistent advice to clients in different regions based on our experience. It is an enormous challenge, but I think that the GBDI database is a fantastic catalyst for that, the transparency and the openness, getting the data stored on there, raising the questions around what, goes from high to low to poor performance, getting behind that data and saying, well, how was that achieved? Those are the sort of questions that can be asked. So I think the platform does a really sophisticated thing to be able to collect data from anywhere in the world, any project typology, and has the ability to have the full depth of detailed data in it. So I think, take Anil's point, the consistency will just need to develop, and I think that the GBDI platform is a great catalyst for that.
Thank you, Julie.
Hi. Well, I am the only from developing country here, so I'm going to give you a different perspective. I think most of the discussion and the data is coming from the north and from Europe, mostly. So embodied carbon in the south in Brazil is probably 70 or 80% of the total carbon over the life cycle. We use very little energy for cooling, and our electricity is really clean for international standards. So for us is a very big deal. We are running a database. Actually, I have in 40 minutes a meeting with the national government and the big building contractors associations on that. What we are selling, the selling point of embodied carbon is very simple. It's the only strategy that we can have to reduce CO2, reducing costs. Because if you go to dematerialization, you can cut costs because you are using less material. Of course, if you go to selecting materials, you can go even further. But we are engaged in the industry with this speech that decarbonization by dematerialization is a negative cost strategy. The second thing is we have very little data in Brazil. But in order to decarbonize a building, you don't really need to know the amount of CO2 that is there. You just put the materials down. So you can use amount of materials as a proxy for the CO2 and make really good decisions. And we are focusing in this moment, our benchmark is only on building structures. Most of our buildings are reinforced concrete buildings with reinforcing concrete walls or masonry buildings. And all the houses are, the structure is the facade and so on. So we are just putting the focus on that. That is probably 70% of the embodied CO2 of our buildings. And there it's a very simple way to measure, because there is not much material. So simplicity is a key. The approach that Europe, you are promoting most of the time, I think in Europe, is too sophisticated. The knowledge gap is huge. So people really don't understand, they don't have the knowledge, but they understand cost is important and they understand dematerialization. Finally, so data validation, what we have in Brazil, we made an agreement with the two larger software providers, the software that do the structural design. We have only two companies in the market. They have 95% of the market in Brazil. And the software will provide the data directly to our database. So if they want to fake a building, they have to fake an entire structural design of the building, because the software will log in the database and put the data. So this is our golden data. Then, of course, if you want to punch the data, you can, but that's going to be rated in a different data. So my point of view, I'm passionate about GBDI, and I think what Martin done is extremely interesting and important, but it's just a beginning of a journey. We need to have a community to build a proper protocol, how to measure. We need to have this open standard. It's much more how we measure it. And we have to have an open standard that works not only for the developed countries, but for developing ones. Otherwise, we are going to nowhere. To finish, just to mention, I think 50% of the building materials in Brazil and 73% of the houses of the Brazilians live in houses. There is, very little design in houses. It's this small business operation in the formal market, and probably 25% of the houses are completely informal. It's done by the families. So if we want to decarbonize our buildings, we have to have a strategy for the informal construction. And this is the truth in the world. Thank you.
For sure. Thanks, Vangelis. I hesitate to cut off the discussion, but we are approaching the end of the time here. So I just want to give Martin the last word and talk about next steps for GBDI and how people can get involved. And any other questions that we've had in the Q&A, we'll try to provide answers afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's too kind. I would love to give a minute to Karen in case you still wanna add to the discussion.
Well, I was going to finish up. I mean, I really just want to give a big thank you to the team who's put this all together, and really endorse all that Vangelis was saying, because he's really been the inspiration behind this project. My involvement has largely been on the fundraising side, and that's not finished because this is really just the beginning. I think for all the work we've done on decarbonization, what we see is it's important to have these metrics as close to the application as possible. For example, there's no point having a metric on cement if you then use two or three times as much cement in the concrete as you need to, and you need to use 2 or 3 times as much concrete in the building. And this is what Vangelis and I really realized when we put together our first report we wrote in 2018, Eco-Efficient Cements. So I think this is a really important step to have a metric that is simple and that everybody can use and is based on materials quantities. Because as Will said, the CO2 comes from the materials. So if we can show whether the materials are being used efficiently or not, it doesn't matter which material, but it's the overall solution which is important. So, I hope everybody, I'm really pleased we've had so many people on this call, and I hope we're going to see everybody again, maybe in a short time, 6 months or a year, to really talk about the next steps. And please try and use the tool, send us questions. This is what we need to take it forward.
Thanks so much, Karen. That was a great segue already into my final remarks. And I thank you both and all for supporting the work of the GBDI so far. What we now presented is the milestone, is the outcome of our first phase. We are planning to continue the work on this in phase 2 and 3. We're really starting the global rollout of this to really develop and advance on whole life carbon benchmarks and integrate different reduction strategies and really work towards monitoring, reporting, and verifying the whole life carbon targets, but also really actionable pathways. One particularly exciting update that I would want to share here is that we've been recently awarded the work on a global track of a whole life carbon by the UK government, together with our highly appreciated partners. We will work on understanding emissions in different world regions, map the emission trajectories, and really also develop a tool for tracking whole life carbon emissions for the coming years and decades until 2050. So this is really interesting, an interesting perspective also for GBDI to advance on the work that we've been doing so far. Now, if you want to join the community, I invite you very much to join the GBDI community. There are different ways to get involved. The easiest is to just join the mailing list so you can stay up to date. But we also invite you to indicate your interest if you want to join the expert group to share your knowledge and really contribute to the development of this. If you have data, or if you're a tool developer, if you want to become a data partner, there is also an option to participate and really co-develop the work of the GBDI. And if you're interested in developing joint projects and raising joint funds, please get in touch and we can explore the opportunities of becoming project partners. If you want to stay in touch, you can follow us on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. You can find the QR codes here. We're always happy to keep you up to date there. And also, if you want to reach out, please, that's a way to reach us. And to wrap it up again, the platform, even though it did not work in my demo today too well, it's up there, it's running, it's open, accessible for you today. It's free to use, so you can just try it out. There are more than 1,000 public sample cases already available. You can also use it to upload your own data and start comparing your data against your friendly competition. And there is an open application programming interface that you can use to connect it to your workflows, to your tools. If you're interested to do that, feel free to also get in touch with us. We will be happy to support you in doing that. And with that, I thank you all very much. And I hand it back over to David for the final closing.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. And I'd just like to extend my sincere thanks to all of the panelists for their really important insights today, and as well to you, Martin, and the entire GBDI team and your partners who work to make this initiative a reality. I think what we heard today is that this is just the beginning, and for it to succeed, we really need broad engagement. The platform needs that contribution of users to survive. So we encourage you all in the audience and your organizations to register and begin to see what's possible. So again, as Martin said, if you want to stay involved, please follow up with the team, stay engaged in the conversation, and let's help build some momentum for a more data-driven, sustainable future. Okay, with that, thank you all again for your time and participations, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.